need you to understand, Russia is with us. They're with Trump.
Russia is with us?
Russia is with Trump.
Who do you think is going to win this upcoming election? Do you think it's a coin flip? Do you think that Biden's still the favorite? I am joined today by former Representative Adam Kinzinger, who made the entire country proud by serving as one of the two Republicans on the January 6th committee. How are you doing today, Adam?
I'm good, and there should have been more than two. I mean, to this day, I still am like, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, why were there only two of us? But yeah, thanks for the introduction. Nice to see you. I'm good.
There were supposed to be more at one point, right? But then...
Yeah, I mean, look, it was, there were people initially that voted for this like bipartisan thing, and then, it only ended up being Liz and I to vote when it was Nancy Pelosi put the committee together because she had no other option because everything else was being stymied. But I mean, yeah, look at the people that, voted to impeach that lost their congressional seats. Like, why didn't they join? But yeah, and obviously, McCarthy had put his members up, and then, two were rejected rightly. And so it's crazy. But yeah, I don't know. I'm still blown away every day that we're here where we are.
Yeah, so let's jump into January 6th real quick. I go to a lot of these rallies and I talk to Trump supporters, and January 6th, Ukraine, just topics revolving around democracy. Those are always what I like to hammer home when I'm talking to MAGA supporters. And they can never connect the dots between Donald Trump's rhetoric and the attack on the Capitol. And what I always say is you can draw a direct line between Donald Trump's rhetoric leading up to the election, after the election, even on January 6th. You can draw a direct line from that, him saying all of our institutions are rigged, everything is against you, to his supporters walking from the ellipse to the Capitol, chanting stuff like hang Mike Pence, 1776. And nobody gets it. Nobody can connect that line. So what would be your, let's say, pitch to a Trump supporter if you were talking to them one-on-one to convince them that January 6th was a function of Donald Trump's rhetoric?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two big things. So let's take the direct line. The direct line, everything you mentioned, and I would add to that, we can actually, and we showed this in one of our hearings, and I guess, there's always things that I wish we could go back and show twice, right, in the same hearing. One of those, though, was that when he tweeted, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done. When he made that tweet, you can directly correlate the timestamp of that tweet. We can correlate people in the crowd, showing their phones and saying, look, this is what Donald Trump sent, and then the acceleration of violence. So you can see a direct link between Donald Trump saying Mike Pence didn't do what he needed to do and an acceleration of violence as a result of that. On the indirect side of things, and what I would say to a MAGA supporter to convince him is pretty simple, because we can speak the same language. I mean, I grew up around this stuff, which is, look, we were a country founded on the idea of revolution, and we're proud of that. And honestly, we should be. We threw off the most powerful empire because we believe that taxation can only exist with representation. That said, you always hear people say, like, the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed by the blood of patriots. Well, yeah, if we lived under an authoritarian government, that's true. The problem is in a system of democracy, when almost half of the country is convinced that an election is stolen, okay? And who was the one convincing them an election was stolen before the election, during, and after? It was only Donald Trump. And then he had his minions come in. When you can convince a significant part of the country the election was stolen, January 6th shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody. I mean, look, if I really believed, Adam, that the election had been stolen, I would have been at the Capitol as a congressman doing violent stuff on January 6th. And this is the issue, is democracy, it's all about having people with different ideas. That's a great thing. But the only thing we have to agree on, no issue, except that we have to agree on that elections are free, fair, and if you're eligible to vote, you can vote. When you convince somebody an election's rigged, you take away that basic system of trust, and violence is the inevitable result. And I think, if I'm telling that to a MAGA person, they'll never admit it, but they understand that language, and they're like, yeah, I get it. And that's what I would say is the most powerful. I think in the depth of their heart, they all, or most of them, know it. They just are unwilling to actually look at it and acknowledge it.
Yeah, you're giving me my talking points for the next rally. I mean, that acceleration of violence part is really, really crucial in my opinion. And also just the date and the time of Donald Trump's rally at the Ellipse, I think is incredibly important because that allowed people to walk over while Mike Pence was certifying the results of the election. And then we saw the peaceful transfer of power get delayed for the first time in American history, right?
Yeah, and here's the other thing that's kind of underreported is, and this wasn't necessarily the big intention by Donald Trump, but to an extent, this was kind of seen as a side intention, was a hope to delay the certification past January 6th, which is why Nancy Pelosi was and frankly Mitch McConnell were very serious about saying we have to finish this certification. They wanted to delay it past January 6th. It technically was because it happened in the early morning of the 7th, but delay it enough that they could go to the Supreme Court, the oppositions to the election, and say, look, according to the Constitution, if Congress doesn't certify this or they don't certify a winner, then Congress votes for the next president. And there was at least a modicum of people that made the decision that if they could get January 6th, like the actual certification somehow canceled or delayed indefinitely, that they could then petition the Supreme Court to say, yes, Congress can now vote, or get, Mike Pence to declare Congress will now vote for the president. Obviously, Republicans own the majority of its delegation, so it's not an actual straight up and down vote, and it would have been Donald Trump. So there were a lot of things that happened before the election, and January 6th that didn't get enough attention, but this was an organized effort to disenfranchise the majority of American voters.
Yep. And would you agree with the idea that even if we remove the attack of the Capitol on January 6th, we can still classify Donald Trump's actions as a coup because of the unconstitutional theory written by John Eastman, his attempt to have Mike Pence unilaterally choose slates of electors in different states? Would you still classify it as a coup even if we removed that attack on January 6th?
I guess I would classify it as something close to a coup. A coup in my mind has to have an action behind it. January 6th was that action. But if you take, as you're saying here, if you take all the things that happened leading up to that and you put that together in a package, it looks like a coup because, look, sitting down with the Department of Justice, and this is something that needs to worry all of us for if Donald Trump wins re-election. We have always made this assumption in our country, with a very few exceptions, that the DOJ is an independent, yes, it's under the president, but it really just executes laws and, X, Y, and Z. And that has been the case. That doesn't have to be the case. The DOJ could literally operate as a law enforcement branch of the president of the United States. And so when Donald Trump sat down in, I think it was mid-December, with, after Bill Barr had resigned, with the acting attorney general and then his wannabe attorney general, and said to Jeff Rosen, just say the election was corrupt. That's all I need from you. Just say it was corrupt. You don't have to do anything else. Leave the rest to me and the Republican members of Congress. What you see in that is Donald Trump's play in everything, where all he wants somebody with authority to do is to create enough of a seed of doubt that he can exploit. And that's exactly what he was trying to do when he was pressuring state officials, when he was pressuring Shea Moss and Ruby Freeman, and when he was sitting down with DOJ and saying, look, I don't need you to make up corruption. Gosh, no, heavens, I just need you to say it was corrupt. And then we'll take on all the dirty work of confusing the American people and destroying their faith in an election.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but when Donald Trump threatened to fire Rosen, didn't other DOJ officials sit him down in the Oval Office and threaten to resign en masse if he ddid that?
Yeah, and they basically called it a suicide pact, where they basically told the president. So here's the interesting thing. So I'm blanking on his name, Eastman or whoever it wasn't Eastman, but Jeffrey, whatever, the other guy that basically Donald Trump wanted to be attorney general. Mm-hmm. Actually, if you look at the Jeffrey Clark, if you look at the White House visitors log from that day, the White House visitors log records Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general. The interesting thing about that is it means that action to make Jeffrey Clark, who was just an environmental lawyer that nobody had ever heard of, to make him acting attorney general had actually happened. And so technically Jeff Rosen was out. The difference is basically everybody came together from DOJ, all these bigwigs, sat down with the president. They had a debate with Jeffrey Clark where Jeffrey Clark was saying, in essence, kissing up to Donald Trump and said, we're all going to resign if you do this. And Trump, at that point, had no choice. But I'm going to tell you, you take 2028 or whatever year that's going to be when Donald Trump is about out of office, and if he wins, and everybody's sitting around that Oval Office, you are not going to have people occupying those positions that would do that, because he's made it very clear. The cost of entry to a new Trump administration is to say the election was stolen,
Yep.
and to basically swear an allegiance not to the Constitution but to him.
Yeah, that actually brings me on to my next question. How big of a threat do you think a second Trump term would be? Because a lot of people make the argument that the guardrails held during his first term, barely, but because they held on, that we should toss him the keys to the truck and let him try to drive off the road again. But to build on your point, Donald Trump wouldn't be starting fresh in 2025. He would be picking up exactly where he left off in January of 2021. So how big of a concern do you think Project 2025 is? Other people in the Trump administration that will now be loyalists, Trump's plan to appoint thousands, tens of thousands of trained and vetted civil servants in key positions of power. How big of a threat do you think this is? Do you think our institutions can withhold a second Trump term?
This is a massive implications. Can our institutions hold? I don't know. Because let's think of it this way, the guardrails of democracy. So let's use the guardrail example, okay? First off, the guardrail was actually hit by a car that was stopped on election day and then had 3 months to accelerate. So basically a short distance, let's call it, to accelerate and hit that guardrail. So it didn't hit it with a lot of impact because they were kind of building this steal the election plane on the fly, right? And so the guardrails held. They're going to have a running start. I mean, they're going to be able to hit this guardrail at 100 miles an hour in a Mack truck now. Secondarily, guardrails on the interstate, if you've ever seen them hit, and I'm sure you have, if they get hit, yes, it's going to keep the car on the bridge, but that guardrail is mangled, and a second impact will tear it off, and that car will go off into the water. Now, I get it. It's heavy on analogy, but it's true, which is the first time to attempt to kind of bust through, democracy, they were inventing this as they went, and they failed. But every failure is a lesson, something you can learn from. And they not only learned from where they failed, they sat around and said, okay, here's how we can do it better next time. Let me give you an example. If they could go back in time, what I think they would do is go back in time and actually, before the states certified the election, they would basically do what they did on January 6th, maybe without the violence, but with the attempt to kind of change the outcome of the election in state legislatures. Because what they were initially trying to do on January 6th was get Mike Pence to send these different states like Pennsylvania back to the state legislature to reassess or to recertify. And you can imagine the chaos that would have enveloped Arizona, for instance, right? If all of a sudden, well, now they're going to know all those plans and be able to fight that battle everywhere. And while he's president, if he's president, they're going to be building for 4 years the machinery to both implement whatever they want to do and also neuter the opposition within the federal government. Look, yes, their civil service gets a bad rap. Sometimes it's earned, sometimes it's not. But it's a necessary function of a big government or of a big country. The idea of stripping that away, people have not even begun to understand the impact of what that would have on our country.
And the scariest part is, I think if Trump and his administration succeeded with that quiet coup that you just described, the one that didn't even involve any violence, I'm not sure the average apolitical American citizen would even understand what happened. They'll realize gas prices haven't really gone up since this has happened. They'll realize my situation hasn't really changed since this has happened. They won't even know who to believe about it. They won't know, do I believe CNN about this? Do I believe Sean Hannity on Fox News? So yeah, this slow erosion of norms, with also like American citizens just not really paying attention, is, I think, a recipe for disaster. Yeah.
It is. And let me just add to that. The other concern is, and it's what Donald Trump does really well. Okay. It's because he's psycho, and like psychos do this. Like he just throws so much information against the wall. So if you're sitting here and let's say we're in 2028 or 5 or whatever, and Pennsylvania gets, there's a fight in the Pennsylvania government about who to certify, even though Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania. You turn on Fox, Fox says this is all legitimate, a legitimate action in the Pennsylvania House. You turn on CNN, CNN's like, this is illegitimate. You sit there as an average American that doesn't necessarily know, because you have a life to live. You sit there and go, I don't know, right? I don't know. So therefore, Yeah, like you said, gas hasn't gone up. I'll just let it be. I'm not going to go to war over this.
Yeah, it's terrifying. From my understanding, Trump is trying to copy that model from Hungary that they implemented there, that slow erosion of norms, stripping different agencies of their independency. And it could absolutely happen. And I feel like most people would not really realize. I also want to ask you, it's kind of a broad question, but who do you think is going to win this upcoming election? Do you think it's a coin flip? Do you think that Biden's still the favorite?
Man, it's such a question. I mean, it depends what day you ask me.
For
If
real.
if you ask me today, I think Donald Trump's going to win. If you'd asked me a week ago, I was pretty optimistic Joe Biden was going to win. I guess the actual answer is it's a coin toss.
Yeah.
But here's the question: and let me be critical of the Biden administration for a second. I haven't heard much from him, right? As far as I know, even Liz Cheney hasn't been reached out to. Maybe she has been. I haven't talked to her about it. I don't think Chris Christie has. There's a lot of disaffected Republicans that want to build what I've called this kind of unstable, uncomfortable coalition between the sane right, the center, and the left.
Yep.
Okay, to defend democracy. They have not. They reached out to me in January and basically said, "Hey, after Nikki Haley's out, we'll definitely want to use you." And I'm like, "Okay, look, I don't need this for my ego. And trust me, my life would be better if I didn't have to go on the trail for Joe Biden. But I'm willing to." But the question is, why aren't they reaching out to that center? Obviously they have a battle on the left on the Gaza issue too. And so I feel like the messaging of the administration is kind of all over the place. And the problem with that, like, I get it. These are tough issues. So it's not critical in terms of how the stands are taking on the issues. But the problem with that is they're up against a guy that has somehow convinced, even though he's actually the weakest, whiniest, smelliest man that's ever existed, truly. But he's convinced Americans that he's tough.
Yep.
Americans like a tough president. Biden, in contrast, doesn't look tough. So if I had to predict it, I mean, because I'm an optimist, I still think Joe Biden's going to win. It's just that we're in a bad moment. But man, we can't take this for granted. We cannot take this for granted.
What you said has been my exact experience. Like 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was literally making bets with my friends that Joe Biden would sweep. I was like, he's going to cruise to re-election. Then you see videos of pro-Palestine protesters and Trump protesters both chanting F Joe Biden at the same time. And you're like, we might be in a little bit of trouble here. But I guess I want to segue that to ask you about a little bit of foreign policy. So I'm 21 years old. This is obviously a massive issue within people in my generation. Actually, I think sometimes it's overstated because when you actually look at the polls, people put foreign policy as their last. But if you go on social media, this is a massive, massive issue among people my age. So in some recent news, President Biden seemed like he wasn't inherently against Israel going into Rafah, but he was only against it if they did not have a humanitarian plan in place. And he ended up withholding bombs. I think he actually decided to send them yesterday. I can't remember. But do you understand where he's coming from there? And what would you have done if you were in his shoes? Do you think it was justified in withholding those bombs?
Look, I do understand where he's coming from. This is such a tough issue. And let me step back for a second and explain the difficulty of what's going on. So when we destroyed ISIS, okay, ISIS still exists, but when we really, the culminating battle against ISIS that made them not the force that they were, it was in the town of Mosul. And it was with U.S. troops and mostly the Iraqi army. If you go to the town of Mosul today, or the city of Mosul, it's big. I actually fought there in the actual real war before the fight against ISIS. If you go to Mosul today, it doesn't exist as it used to. It was basically destroyed. Now, why weren't so many tens of thousands of civilians killed in Mosul? It's pretty easy. Because a warning was sent, they were able to leave, and the only people that stayed in Mosul were ISIS. So at that point, you can in essence destroy a city, destroy ISIS. The difficulty in Gaza right now is, obviously the idea of releasing, everybody that lives in Gaza to seek sanctuary in Israel, that's not going to happen. Let's put that aside. Egypt and Jordan have their borders closed. Look at the border wall Egypt has built with Gaza. They will not let anybody in. So now Israel has to execute a counterterrorism or a counterinsurgency mission in a population where you cannot allow people to leave. They have nowhere to go. So that's why they've tried to do this compartmentalized, leave North Gaza, and now it's Rafah. So I can understand where President Biden is coming from, and I I guess I would say I support it. I think Israel needs to wrap this operation up, pivot to a counterterrorism operation, which is, look, Hamas is not going to be eliminated anytime soon. So you can continue to prosecute the war against Hamas, similar to what we're doing against ISIS. But understand that every day you turn the population against you, you're only allowing Hamas to recruit more people. So there's no easy answers here. And I think the president was probably right to say, hey, we don't just give you a blank check on this aid. Like, we're not going to stop you from doing whatever you want to do in Rafah, but we've got, and it was specifically 1,500 and 2,000 pound bombs that were withheld. Those do some big amounts of destruction. So yeah, I can see where it comes from. I also can say, though, Hamas is an evil organization, and if I could wave a wand and kill every Hamas member personally, I would do it. And I also would save every innocent Gazan that I could with that same wand.
Yeah, I always use the phrase "free Palestine from Hamas" first and foremost.
Correct.
And my dad is Muslim, so we spend every day arguing about this back and forth. He's a little bit more pro-Palestine. I'm a little bit on the opposite end. And I always tell him that the fundamental difference between Hamas and the IDF, he always tries to draw this equivalency. It's a false equivalency, of course, is that Hamas believes in certainty of paradise. They believe in martyrdom, which then allows them to justify as many civilian casualties as possible to reach their end goal, whereas the IDF tries to protect its civilian population with the Iron Dome, of course. So I think that is the fundamental difference. Would you agree there?
Absolutely. And let's keep in mind, there is one way. First off, a ceasefire existed until October 7th. What happened on October 7th? Yes, it was an attack on the civilian population. It was an attack that was filmed with GoPros because they wanted the despicable violence against innocent people, particularly attending a music festival. They wanted that violence to be put out in high quality, high definition. Israel respond. Look, I got to tell you, I'm a historian a bit. If you start a war, there is nobody that's ever started a war that came out better. You're going to get it handed to you. And yes, the IDF makes mistakes. Yes, the United States military made mistakes in the last 20 years. But the reality is this war would end tomorrow if Hamas released every remaining hostage and if they relinquished power to somebody like the Palestinian Authority or an Arab governing coalition that could come in and peacekeep. The war would be over tomorrow. That's the best way to an immediate ceasefire. But the idea that we're going to allow, I say we, that Israel or really freedom-loving people are going to allow Hamas to continue to plan and threaten, it's an unrealistic objective.
And listen, I think, I want to know, do you think that the optics would be a little bit different if on October 7th, Hamas decided to only target military infrastructure? You think that'd be a different story?
100%. Look, in the law of armed conflict, there is basically rules. You got to wear a uniform. You have to be an identifiable side. Any civilian attacks have to be accidental, has to be proportional, right? If Hamas, yes, if they would have cut the border fence, you can argue they should have worn uniforms. Let's say they didn't wear uniforms, okay? We fight terrorist organizations that don't wear uniforms all the time. But if they'd have gone after the Israeli outposts or Israeli military, yeah, Israel would have responded because it's a war. But I think the vast majority of us would be sitting here saying, yeah, I mean, Israel should fight back. But at the same time, when you put on a uniform, you become a target on behalf of your country. Very different situation than walking into a kibbutz or walking into a music festival, shooting women in the head, raping them. And why we can't say that women in Israel were raped, I don't understand this, because we're supposed to be pro-woman and anti-sexual violence. It happened. And they chose soft civilian targets on purpose. And again, look, I've been to war, right? The civilian population, we have to do everything we can to protect them. And to the extent the United States can exert influence to help with that, to kind of tamp down some of the emotion of the Israeli military and say, look, here, we're going to act as big brother and help you. It actually is to Israel's benefit for us to do that. But the idea that they're just going to put up their hands and say, well, we weren't able to do it in 6 months, I think is unrealistic.
And it's so frustrating going back to the rape part. It's because the New York Times released this article where they released 7 different accounts of women being raped on October 7th, and they retracted one of the 7 stories. And people will always use that in arguments to say all of these stories are fake because they retracted one story, therefore the rest of the stories are fake. When there was a UN report showing that there was systemic rape going on October 7th.
That's right.
It is pretty disgusting. I'm going to play for you a clip really quickly of me talking to a Trump supporter about Ukraine. Actually, it's 2 separate clips. You may enjoy them. It's 90 seconds, so it's a little bit long, but it's worth it. What do you think about the funding of Ukraine?
No, I don't think that should happen.
Why not?
Because we need to take care of America first.
America first? I agree, but
America first.
I'd make the argument that funding Ukraine is exactly how we put America first, because a lot of people think we're sending cash bags, but we're sending old military equipment, right? And after we send that military equipment, we get to create new American jobs to restock and repile that, right?
That's a good point.
On top of
That's a
that,
good point.
do you think Vladimir Putin's our enemy?
Not really,
Really, why not?
because I think he's trying to run his own country, and he's not. I don't think he is a threat to America.
It's okay that he's running his own country, but the problem is when he starts to invade other countries next to him. So we should protect sovereign countries. We should protect our allies, essentially, right?
I agree.
So-
That's like us trying to invade Canada.
And that wouldn't be okay.
Right.
So to piece my argument together, we're creating new American jobs, and in the process, we get to protect an ally, a sovereign country, Ukraine, from, I think Vladimir Putin is a dictator. He's a threat. He's not a good guy. So I think we're protecting America's interests. I think this is exactly how we put America first, right? Can you see that point of view?
That is a very good point. That's a good point. You've educated me a lot. I appreciate that.
Awesome, and we're both coming from the same point of view of putting America first.
Right.
How can we put America first on the world stage? And sometimes it scares me when they say we put America first by letting Vladimir Putin do what he wants. That doesn't make sense.
Right. How old are you?
21.
You're very wise for your age.
Thank you. I've really appreciated talking to you.
It's good talking to you.
I want you to understand, Russia is with us. They're with Trump.
Russia is with us.
Russia is with Trump.
Russia's not with the USA. One of their main goals is to
Putin
destabilize.
is with Trump. I guarantee it.
You think so?
You just don't know yet.
That's not the flex you think it is, though. Putin is a bad faith actor who invades countries, has imperial ambitions.
Well, why does Trump get along with him then? Trump gets along with everybody. North Korea, everybody. Everybody likes Trump.
Yeah, that's something to think about. He's so close. He's so close to the point. But that makes me wonder, how do you think Republicans, or MAGA Republicans in particular, have gotten so twisted where they think putting America first as being an isolationist, like it's still 1939?
I want to say first off, if I ever run for president and it's in 14 years, like you'll be a contender for my vice president, man, because you can articulate very well. Look, I mean, I look at it, and to an extent I get kind of sad because particularly on that first clip, that is a good meaning person, right? Like he truly, when you told him the fact that unfortunately people don't understand, which is all we're doing is actually replenishing our stocks, like stuff that's going to age out anyway and making our military stronger. Unfortunately, they don't hear that on Fox News. They actually really don't hear it on many places because most people don't understand that. But you can see that he's a good, well-meaning person. The second guy, I mean, yeah, to sit there and say that Vladimir Putin is on our side or is on Trump's side, let's keep this in mind. The Russian economy, which is now pivoted to basically being a one-trick pony, a war economy that's funded by oil. It reminds us of a lot of Middle East countries. The Russian economy is the size of Italy against the United States economy, which basically exceeds that of all of Europe. If we want to align ourselves with a failing country, a declining population, with drunk men that basically all die at the age of 62 if they don't stab each other to death prior, and send people to where there's been 450,000 casualties. Every 5 days, there are as many Russians killed as we lost in 20 years in Afghanistan. If that is the leader in the country that you want to hold up on a pedestal, be my guest. But let me tell you, as a Christian myself, this idea that Vladimir Putin is somehow the defender of Christianity when he's prosecuting Christians in Crimea, when when they left Bucha and Irpin, you see that they abused and killed priests and preachers that were there, Baptist ministers, Orthodox priests. When you see missiles indiscriminately flying into churches, there is no God I follow that would take a man like Vladimir Putin and say, you are the example of me. And unfortunately, these people have been abused for their money. They've been abused for their vote. And they've been abused for the power that every individual American can give to a politician by a terrible man. And now the lackeys that follow him, like, frankly, even Speaker Johnson and all the Republicans in Congress.
Yeah, especially Marjorie Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene. But it really feels like a lot of this is a function of Russian propaganda seeping into the mainstream. I mean, you have people like Tucker Carlson, who actually, he's not on Fox News anymore, but he was spewing Russian propaganda on Fox News. Vivek Ramaswamy copying Kremlin talking points verbatim. Elon Musk owns X, and on X, there's a bunch of Russian propaganda. And it really feels like Russia is waging this invisible holy war on the West through Russian propaganda. So do you think, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say that I think you're absolutely right. So in 2015, I remember Dana Rohrabacher was a congressman from California, and I would debate with him on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He was a Republican, and he was pro-Putin, only pro-Putin in Congress. And people would tell me, Adam, don't engage with him. We literally think he was on the FSB payroll, by the way. And so, but 5 years later, or what, now we're 9 years later, the entire party is almost in this position. And I think it is absolutely the impact of things like Twitter. You know, I think it's the misinformation from Twitter or from X or from whatever, Truth Social, TikTok, that then leaks over to a Fox News story that then has millions of eyeballs. Or you can see the direct influence where a story comes out and it's put out by what seems like a normal website. It'll be like, you know, the News Today or whatever. And then there's a couple of websites that pick it up, and then a mainstream media website picks it up because it's been picked up by enough. And that is directly traced to the Kremlin. And the problem is, in a free society, we're not pushing back against this. We don't have a government agency that's trying to, in essence, re-educate Americans about the truth. Because if we created something like that, Rand Paul would call it the Truth Department in 1984. So we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back and just hoping that freedom and the internet overcomes Russian propaganda. And unfortunately, it's not working.
That's part of the reason I like to have these on-the-ground conversations, because to touch back on the first dude I talked to, I really do think, I said this before our talk, but I think a lot of these people are just like my aunt or uncle who have been misled into voting against their own interests. And all you need to do is introduce them to new ways of thinking, introduce them to fact patterns they wouldn't have heard otherwise. So to tie this all together, one final question. Do you think a return to normalcy is possible for the Republican Party? Do you think there will be a Republican Party someday that is ardently pro-democracy, anti-Russia, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, the details I don't know, but I do think there will be a normal Republican Party again someday, or it will die. I mean, the reality is there's those two options. It will either have to do that or die. Why do I say that? Right now, the thing that's keeping the Republican Party afloat is baby boomers. I mean, really, it's these people that have this beef for 50 years. They've, whatever, they could go into baby boomers, but they're the ones that are addicted to this anger that Fox News spoons to them. Sadly, because my parents are boomers, but boomers are dying off. And, if Donald Trump loses, I think that is a really big impact to the GOP, and will finally maybe do what January 6th wasn't able to, which is force them to reckon. There's nothing like power that does that. Or if Donald Trump wins and he's president for 4 years, no president of the United States, particularly somebody like Trump, comes out more popular than they went in. So it may be the swan song. So I think it gets there. I don't want to give people hope it's going to be in the next 5 or 6 months. It may be the next 5 or 10 years, but it will, or it dies, because there is room for a vibrant center-right movement that is not being filled by the GOP right now.
Yeah, and there's a theory that, it's not a theory, but usually after a party loses an election, they tend to mediate a little bit and move back towards the center. So hopefully we see that happen after Donald Trump hopefully loses come November. Thank you for your time, Adam. I really enjoyed talking about January 6th and foreign policy. This was a great chat. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, you too. I enjoyed it. Thanks.